History remembers emperors as conquerors, builders, and visionaries. But hidden behind the marble columns of Rome lies a story that strips away all the glory and reveals the monstrous heart of absolute power. It begins not with a war or a rebellion, but with a boy named Sporus, beautiful, fragile, and destined to become one of history's most tragic figures. In the age of Nero, the empire stretched from Britain to the deserts of Syria. Rome glittered with gold, yet its foundations were rotting with fear and madness. Nero, once a golden child of the empire, had already burned his own city, silenced his rivals, and watched love turn to ashes. When his beloved wife Poppaea Sabina died, some say by his own hands, something inside him shattered. And from that fracture came an obsession. When Nero saw Sporus, he didn't see a person. He saw a mirror of his lost love, and an opportunity to defy death itself. What followed was not romance, it was transformation by tyranny. Sporus was forced to surrender his body, his identity, even his name. He was paraded through Rome dressed as an empress, a living replica of the woman who haunted Nero's dreams. This isn't just a story about one emperor's madness. It's about the terrifying reach of power, the moment when love, grief, and control collide, and a human being becomes a possession. This is the story of Sporus, the castrated boy who became Nero's living doll. Rome, 65 AD. The empire stands at its dazzling height, stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the burning sands of Syria. The marble temples gleam under the Italian sun, senators stride through colonnades in their white togas, and the streets echo with the sounds of traders, poets, and soldiers. To an outsider, this is the center of the world, a civilization of art, power, and divine order. But behind the golden facades, in the heart of the imperial palace, the empire's soul is rotting. And at the center of this decay stands a single man, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the emperor who once promised glory and now rules through fear, desire, and madness. Nero is barely in his late 20s, yet he has already reshaped Rome in his own image. He loves music, theater, and beauty more than politics or justice. He believes himself not merely emperor but artist, a god chosen to bring beauty to the world, even if it burns in the process. His new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, is the clearest reflection of his mind. It stretches across the heart of Rome like a monument to obsession. Gold leaf covers its ceilings, jeweled mosaics shimmer across its walls, fountains burst from marble lions, spraying perfume into the air. Guests walk on floors of ivory and mother of pearl while the emperor's statues smile down from every corner. It is paradise built on ashes, because the city that once stood there burned in a great fire just 1 year earlier. That fire destroyed thousands of homes and lives. Many believed Nero himself ordered it, that he wanted a clean canvas for his artistic dreams. The rumors whispered that he watched the flames from his balcony, strumming his lyre, singing about the fall of Troy. He blamed the Christians for starting it, but no one truly believed him. Rome began to see its emperor not as a god, but as a man possessed, a ruler so addicted to beauty and control that he would sacrifice anything for it. By 65 AD, Nero's rule had become a theater of fear. The Senate bowed but no longer respected him. The Praetorian Guard obeyed his orders, but their loyalty was thin as smoke. The nobles smiled in public and cursed his name in private. Even his friends trembled, because Nero had already killed too many of them, and often for reasons no one could understand. His own mother, Agrippina, the woman who had raised him to the throne, was executed by his order. His first wife, Octavia, was banished and later killed. Rome's elite learned that the closer one stood to Nero's golden throne, the closer one stood to death. And yet, amid all this terror, Nero was grieving. His second wife, Poppaea Sabina, had died the previous year. She was said to be the only person he had ever truly loved. Poppaea was elegant, cunning, and beautiful, the perfect match for a man who craved admiration more than affection. Their relationship, though, was as violent as it was passionate. Some chroniclers claim that in a moment of rage, Nero struck her while she was pregnant, killing her and their unborn child. Others say she died from illness. The truth was lost beneath the layers of palace secrecy and imperial propaganda. What was certain is that Nero was never the same afterward. He withdrew from the world, consumed by guilt and obsession. At night, he wandered through the silent corridors of his palace calling Poppaea's name. He built statues in her image, painted frescoes of her smile, and ordered singers to perform hymns in her honor. He spoke to her as if she were still alive. His grief was not love. It was possession that refused to die. To the few servants allowed near him, it seemed as though the emperor was waiting, not to move on, but to find a way to bring her back. It was in this atmosphere of grief, luxury, and madness that Sporus entered the story. No one knew exactly where he came from. He was likely a young freedman, someone born into servitude but later granted partial independence within the imperial household. His duties were modest, assisting attendants, helping with minor affairs in the palace, ensuring the emperor's private quarters ran smoothly. But what made Sporus stand out was not his work, it was his beauty. He had delicate features, smooth skin, and large dark eyes that seemed both innocent and intelligent. In a city that worshipped beauty as a sign of divine favor, Sporus's appearance was a dangerous gift. He attracted glances wherever he went. Some saw him as the perfect servant, quiet, graceful, and loyal. Others saw him as a symbol of temptation. But for Nero, Sporus became something far more dangerous, a reflection of the woman he had lost. One evening, during a gathering in the palace, Nero noticed the boy among the attendants. At first, it was just a glance, but the resemblance struck him with the force of revelation. Sporus's profile, his posture, even the softness of his voice, they all reminded Nero of Poppaea. He called for the boy to approach. Servants froze. Sporus bowed, unaware that his fate had already been sealed in that moment. The emperor studied him in silence, his eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite desire. Then he smiled, and dismissed everyone else from the room. From that day on, Sporus's life was no longer his own. Nero summoned him often, asking him to recite verses, to play the lyre, to walk with him through the gardens of the Golden House. At first, it seemed harmless, the emperor simply taking comfort in the presence of someone who reminded him of better days. But soon, Nero's fascination deepened into obsession. He ordered Sporus to wear fine clothes, then jewels, then the very garments that once belonged to Poppaea. He began to call him by her name. The palace whispered. Ministers avoided the emperor's eyes. No one dared question the madness, because to question Nero was to die. Sporus, caught between obedience and terror, could do nothing but comply. He had seen what happened to those who resisted the emperor's will: exile, torture, execution. The imperial physicians were called in. The order they received was unspeakable, but clear. In a chamber lined with marble and silk, under the pretext of divine purification, they took from Sporus what made him a man. The act was silent and final. When it was over, Nero looked at him and said softly, "Now you are perfect." No decree was issued, no law recorded. But in that moment, history shifted. A young man was remade into an illusion. Love was replaced by possession. Beauty became punishment. And the empire that had once conquered the world now revealed its true face, not of strength or honor, but of power so absolute it could bend reality itself. Outside, Rome still glittered under the sun. Senators gave speeches. Gladiators fought in the arena. Life went on as if nothing had changed. But in the secret heart of the palace, behind walls of gold and mirrors, the first act of one of history's darkest tragedies had begun. This was not the Rome of legends or glory. This was the Rome of shadows, where gods and men blurred into monsters, and where a boy named Sporus would soon learn what it meant to live as a reflection of the dead. The night after the procedure, the halls of the Golden House were silent. Outside, the torches along the Palatine Hill flickered in the wind, but within the palace, there was only the muffled sound of footsteps and the low hum of water running through marble fountains. Sporus awoke surrounded by silk sheets and the smell of incense. His body ached, but the greater pain was invisible, the realization that something inside him had been taken forever. He was alive, but no longer whole. Nero visited him that morning, wearing the serene smile of a man who believed he had done something divine. "You will be loved as she was," he whispered. "You will live as she did." The emperor's words were meant as comfort, but to Sporus they sounded like a sentence. From that moment on, Nero began what he called the resurrection. He summoned jewelers, dressmakers, and servants from across the empire. Gold threads were spun into robes, emeralds were set into crowns. The most skilled artisans of Rome were ordered to transform the boy into the image of the dead empress. Day after day, Sporus was dressed, perfumed, and taught how to move, how to speak, how to smile. His tutors were women from the imperial court, chosen for their elegance, not their empathy. They guided his steps through the marble corridors, teaching him to glide like a queen, not walk like a servant. At first, he resisted in small ways, standing too stiff, speaking too softly, refusing to meet Nero's eyes. But each act of defiance was met with the same response: silence and then reward. Nero would smile gently, praise his beauty, offer him jewels, then remind him that he was loved because he was her. It was not cruelty in the usual sense. It was control disguised as affection, manipulation masked by tenderness. Soon, Sporus began to understand that survival depended on surrender. If he resisted, he might disappear as so many before him had. If he complied, he might at least live another day. And so, he became what Nero desired, the perfect reflection. In the palace, servants were instructed to address him as Sabina, the empress's name. The imperial heralds were told to treat him as the emperor's consort. Even the guards at the gates bowed as he passed, pretending not to see the truth behind the silk veils and golden ornaments. Rome had always loved its spectacles, and Nero's court was the greatest theatre of all. The day of the wedding arrived only weeks after the transformation. Invitations were sent to the most powerful men of the empire: senators, generals, foreign envoys, all compelled to attend under pain of death. The ceremony took place in the grand atrium of the Golden House, a hall lined with columns of marble and gold, its floor scattered with rose petals. Musicians played soft lyres as incense drifted through the air. At the center stood Nero, radiant in imperial purple, and beside him, Sporus, or rather, the new Sabina. He was dressed in a gown of white and silver, his hair adorned with pearls, his expression frozen between fear and emptiness. The high priest of Jupiter himself was summoned to officiate the ritual. As Nero placed a ring upon Sporus's finger, the crowd murmured blessings they did not mean. No one dared to look away. No one dared to speak. The marriage was declared sacred and eternal. But it was neither. It was theatre, a performance written by a man who no longer understood the difference between love and possession. That night, as Rome whispered in disbelief, Nero celebrated with laughter and wine, parading his new wife through the banquet hall. Guests raised their cups, pretending to rejoice, while their faces revealed disgust and pity. In the days that followed, the spectacle continued. Nero and Sporus appeared together in public, at the theatre, at ceremonies, even at gladiatorial games. The emperor presented his new empress to the people, and though the crowds cheered out of fear, the truth spread quickly. Everyone in Rome knew who Sporus really was. The gossip reached every corner of the city, from taverns to temples, but no one dared speak too loudly. For Sporus, life became a series of performances. Each morning, he was dressed and adorned as a queen. Each evening, he dined beside the emperor, smiling when expected, silent when not. He was not allowed to be seen without his jewelry or feminine attire. Even his voice was trained to sound softer, gentler, almost musical. He was, in every sense, a living monument to Nero's madness. Behind the closed doors of the palace, the dynamic between them shifted constantly. Nero could be affectionate one hour and furious the next. If Sporus failed to mimic Poppaea's mannerisms perfectly, the way she once laughed, the tilt of her head, he was punished with cold silence or sharp words. Yet, when he succeeded, Nero would shower him with gifts, golden necklaces, villas, even a retinue of servants. The emperor seemed genuinely convinced that he had recreated the love he once lost. But beneath this illusion, Sporus's spirit eroded. He lived in constant tension, trapped between fear and the faint hope that one day, somehow, Nero's interest would fade. At night, when the palace finally quieted, he would sit alone near the fountains, staring into the water. His reflection looked back at him, distorted by ripples of torchlight, not a man, not a woman, just a hollow image of what the emperor wanted him to be. Outside the palace, discontent brewed. Senators whispered of rebellion. Generals in distant provinces grumbled about Nero's extravagance. The emperor's obsession with his living empress became a symbol of everything wrong with his rule: indulgent, wasteful, and disconnected from reality. Yet, for Nero, Sporus was proof of divine power. Even death, he told his advisers, cannot take from me what I love. I have brought her back. The more the empire decayed, the more he clung to that illusion. He took Sporus on tours of Greece, parading him before foreign dignitaries. At each stop, he introduced him as his wife, and the guests, horrified but polite, played along. There were banquets, festivals, and endless applause, all of it choreographed for Nero's vanity. For Sporus, every journey was another layer of humiliation. He was watched constantly, dressed in the empress's robes, forced to sit beside Nero as courtiers bowed and called him Augusta. The role had consumed everything that once made him human. His name, his body, his will, all rewritten by the emperor's grief. In private moments, fragments of his former self flickered. He still spoke softly to the servants who pitied him. Sometimes, he touched the marble walls and whispered prayers to gods who had long since stopped listening. There were days when he almost believed he had become who Nero said he was, as if the lie had devoured the truth completely. But then he would remember his own voice, his own laughter, and the pain returned sharper than ever. The transformation of Sporus was not merely the story of one man's cruelty. It was the reflection of a system where one person's will could become reality, no matter how monstrous. Rome had created an emperor so powerful that he could erase another's identity and call it love. And those who watched, the senators, the priests, the servants, all remained silent, complicit in the theater of tyranny. In the gilded halls of the Golden House, Nero continued to celebrate, oblivious to the crumbling world outside. His empire was unraveling, but inside his palace of mirrors, everything gleamed, gold, marble, and illusion. And in that glittering prison stood Sporus, the emperor's living doll, smiling for an audience that had forgotten how to feel. The wedding had been a spectacle, but what came after was something far worse, a life lived inside a lie so perfect that it erased everything that came before. From the moment Nero placed the golden ring on Sporus's trembling hand, the young man ceased to exist in the eyes of Rome. The emperor's bride had been born, and her name was Sabina. In the days that followed, the transformation became total. Every trace of the old Sporus was buried beneath layers of silk, gold, and performance. His hair was perfumed and curled by attendants each morning. His skin was rubbed with oils imported from Alexandria. He wore jewels once belonging to Poppaea, necklaces heavy with emeralds, earrings shaped like tiny suns. His new identity was reinforced with every gesture and every word. Servants greeted him with bows and addressed him as Augusta, the title reserved for empresses. He was forbidden to speak in the lower tones of a man or to show any hint of his past. Rome's courtiers quickly learned how to play along. They smiled, bowed, and pretended to celebrate the emperor's marriage, though behind every smile lay revulsion or pity. The empire had seen cruelty before, but never this, a man trying to resurrect the dead by reshaping the living. Still, no one dared to speak against it. The Senate, the generals, even the priests of Jupiter all chose silence, because silence was safer than truth. For Sporus, each day became an act of survival. He lived in the palace like a prisoner wrapped in silk. The walls glittered with gold, but the air was heavy, filled with whispers and the faint echo of footsteps that always seemed to follow him. There was no privacy, no moment of solitude. His meals were shared with Nero, his walks observed by guards, his nights spent beneath the gaze of a man who believed he had conquered death. The emperor's moods were unpredictable. Some days he was gentle, speaking softly, calling Sporus by Poppaea's name as if the past had never ended. He would read poetry aloud, his voice trembling with emotion, then place his hand on Sporus's cheek and whisper, "You see, even the gods envy us." On other days, the madness returned. He would rage without reason, overturning tables, accusing his advisers of betrayal, or weeping at the memory of his dead wife. Sporus learned to adapt, to become the reflection that Nero needed in each moment. If Nero wanted tenderness, he smiled softly. If Nero wanted silence, he became still as marble. Over time, the boy who once had a name, a body, a will, faded. In his place stood a shadow wearing a crown. The imperial court became a theater built around this illusion. Banquets, ceremonies, and festivals were organized to display the emperor's empress. Senators and ambassadors were summoned to witness the couple's appearances. When Nero entered the theater, Sporus followed, dressed in white and gold, his face covered with a translucent veil. The crowd would rise to applaud, pretending to admire the union that had become the empire's shame. Outside the palace, the people of Rome whispered. Some pitied Sporus, calling him the emperor's doll. Others mocked the emperor's madness. But even gossip was dangerous. Spies of the Praetorian Guard listened everywhere. A single careless word could mean execution. Fear became the city's common language. Yet beneath the golden terror, there were moments of unbearable quiet, moments when Sporus almost forgot who he had been. In the stillness of the palace gardens, under moonlight, he sometimes touched his reflection in the fountains. The water rippled, distorting the image until he no longer recognized the face that stared back. He would whisper his real name, not Sabina, but Sporus, just to remember how it sounded. Sometimes he would cry, though the tears never lasted long. The next morning, the attendants would arrive, and the mask would return. Nero's obsession only deepened. He took Sporus on public tours through Greece and Asia Minor, displaying him to the world as the living embodiment of his lost love. Every city they visited was ordered to prepare statues and temples in their honor. In Corinth, Nero held a grand festival where he competed in music contests, declaring himself the victor of every event. Sporus was always beside him, silent and smiling, as crowds cheered under threat of death. Foreign dignitaries, though horrified, praised the emperor's divine union, because to do otherwise was suicide. The longer this charade continued, the more it revealed the emperor's unraveling mind. Nero began to believe that the gods themselves envied him. He claimed that he had achieved what no mortal could, the power to defeat death and reshape destiny. "She lives again," he told the Senate, "and Rome shall live through her." His speeches blended poetry and delusion, while the empire itself began to crumble under corruption and revolt. For Sporus, life blurred into an endless performance. He learned that every smile, every gesture, every word could decide whether he lived another day. He moved through the palace like a ghost, graceful, obedient, voiceless. Even the servants stopped addressing him by name. To them, he was a sacred object, a relic of the emperor's madness. But the illusion could not last forever. Beyond the gilded walls, the empire was boiling. Provinces rose in rebellion, soldiers muttered about treason, and governors plotted in secret. Nero ignored it all, convinced that art and love would save him. He hosted more plays, more banquets, more ceremonies, desperate to drown the noise of a collapsing world. Sporus was always at his side, a silent witness to the emperor's descent. The first cracks appeared when the Praetorian Guard began to turn. The men who once protected the emperor now whispered about replacing him. Nero sensed it, and his paranoia grew. He accused senators of plotting his death, executed trusted advisors, and forbade anyone to leave Rome without his permission. Sporus watched as the palace, once filled with music and laughter, became a fortress of fear. There were nights when Nero would wake screaming, convinced that Poppaea's spirit had come to punish him. He would call for Sporus, clutching him in panic, crying out her name. "Don't leave me again," he would sob, trembling like a child. Sporus would hold him, whispering the words Nero wanted to hear, though his heart was hollow. Somewhere deep inside, he pitied the emperor. The man who had destroyed him was also a man destroyed by his own guilt. By 68 AD, the empire finally turned against its ruler. Revolts erupted across the provinces. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. The streets filled with soldiers loyal to new leaders, Galba in Spain, Vindex in Gaul. The end was coming, and even Nero's illusions could not save him. Sporus stayed by his side until the final flight from Rome. He had no choice. To abandon the emperor would have meant execution. To follow him was simply another kind of death. When Nero fled the city in disguise, Sporus rode with him, still dressed in the empress's robes, still playing the role that had consumed his life. As they hid in the countryside, waiting for news, the emperor's despair grew unbearable. Surrounded by loyal servants and the remnants of his guard, Nero realized what awaited him: capture, humiliation, and execution. "What an artist dies in me," he murmured, tears streaming down his face. He turned to Sporus and asked him to sing one of the songs Poppaea used to love. The boy's voice trembled but obeyed. When the song ended, Nero whispered, "You must live. Tell them I was loved." Hours later, as enemy riders approached, Nero took his own life. Sporus was left standing in silence, still dressed as a bride, as the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty fell. The empire would survive. Rome would rebuild. But for Sporus, there was no return. He had been remade too completely, his identity rewritten too deeply. The name, the body, the person he once was, all lost to the madness of a man who could not let go of his ghosts. In that stillness after Nero's death, surrounded by ashes and memory, Sporus finally understood the cruelest truth. He had never been loved, only possessed. When Nero's lifeless body collapsed upon the floor of that small villa outside Rome, the empire seemed to exhale for the first time in years. Yet for Sporus, that exhale brought no freedom. The man who had stolen his life was gone, but the shadow Nero cast over him still stretched across every corner of the empire. The tyrant was dead, but the memory of his madness still lived in the hearts of those who had survived it. In the weeks following Nero's suicide, Rome descended into chaos. The throne was empty, and ambition rushed to fill the void. Generals, senators, and governors each claimed their right to rule, and the Praetorian Guard sold loyalty to the highest bidder. In the midst of this storm, the remnants of Nero's household, servants, guards, musicians, and those closest to him, were rounded up, questioned, and repurposed. Among them was Sporus, the empress of a dead emperor. At first, the new rulers treated him not as a victim but as property, a valuable artifact of Nero's reign. He was passed from one hand to another, his fate decided in whispered deals between men who saw him not as a person, but as a symbol of legitimacy, proof that they now controlled what once belonged to Nero. To possess him was to inherit a piece of the fallen emperor's power. The new Emperor Galba, stern and aging, summoned Sporus to his court. There was no affection in the man's eyes, no madness like Nero's, only calculation. He questioned him coldly about the former emperor's private affairs, the names of allies, the locations of treasures, the secrets whispered in the dark. Sporus answered what he could, though each word cost him a fragment of himself. Galba listened, nodded, and ordered that the boy be kept under watch. Days passed, and Sporus lived like an echo inside the imperial palace, neither prisoner nor free. His clothes were plain again, his jewels confiscated, but the ghost of his false identity clung to him. Servants still whispered Augusta behind his back, half in mockery, half in fear. Even stripped of luxury, he remained the living reminder of the empire's shame, the boy who had been turned into an empress. Galba ruled for only a few months. His reign, harsh and joyless, ended the way all brutal power ends, in blood. When he was assassinated by his own soldiers in January of 69 AD, Rome erupted once more. Sporus, along with the rest of the palace, was handed to the victor like spoils of war. That victor was Otho, once a friend of Nero and rumoured rival for Poppaea's affection. Irony, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humour. Otho had known Sporus years before, back when the boy still served in Nero's household, and seeing him again stirred something unexpected. Unlike the others, Otho did not mock him, nor did he treat him as an object. He offered Sporus a quiet corner of his palace, attendance, and a measure of dignity. "You have suffered enough," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. For a brief moment, Sporus almost believed he might finally rest. Otho's rule was merciful compared to Nero's, short-lived, but human. The new emperor saw in the young man a mirror of his own survival, both of them remnants of a vanished world. They shared meals in silence, spoke occasionally of art, poetry, and the absurd cruelty of fate. Perhaps, in some small way, Otho saw in Sporus a kindred spirit, someone who had also loved and lost Poppaea to Nero's fire. But peace in Rome never lasted. By April of that same year, Otho's armies faced another challenger, Vitellius, a brutal general marching from Germany with legions at his back. The civil war that followed was swift and merciless. Otho's forces were crushed, and the emperor, unwilling to prolong the bloodshed, took his own life. Before he died, he sent for Sporus one last time. "Leave this city," he said softly. "The gods have cursed us both. Do not wait for mercy from those who will come after me." Sporus wept for him, not as one weeps for a lover, but for a man who had shown a fragment of kindness in a world that had none. But he could not escape Rome. The victors entered the city like conquerors, and once again, the boy was claimed. Under Vitellius, the empire sank into grotesque spectacle. The new emperor was loud, gluttonous, and cruel. He surrounded himself with sycophants and entertainers, turning the imperial court into a parody of Nero's excesses, without any of Nero's charm or artistry. For him, Sporus was not a symbol of beauty or tragedy, but a trophy, a joke to amuse his guests. Vitellius delighted in humiliating the relics of his predecessors. He made senators dance, poets perform, and generals serve him food. But the greatest cruelty was reserved for Sporus. One evening, at a banquet thick with wine and laughter, Vitellius proposed a play, a reenactment of the myth of Persephone's abduction, in which a maiden is seized and dragged into the underworld. The emperor laughed as he announced that Sporus would play the maiden. The hall erupted in drunken applause. Sporus sat frozen, pale as marble, unable to breathe. He understood what the performance meant. It was not a play but a ritual of humiliation, one that would end in public violation, watched by thousands. The next morning, the preparations began. They brought him the costume, a silk gown dyed the color of spring, a crown of flowers, and a veil to hide his face. The symbolism was cruelly perfect. The last remnants of Nero's empress would now be paraded before Rome as a mockery of innocence. That night, Sporus sat alone in his chamber, staring at the garments laid before him. The sound of laughter from the banquet hall echoed through the corridors. mixing with the faint music of flutes. 4 years, he had survived by becoming what others demanded: a wife, a widow, a symbol. But this final act, this public degradation, was beyond endurance. He thought of Nero's last words, of Otho's warning, and of the life he had once lived before the palace, a life so distant it felt like another person's dream. As dawn approached, Sporus made his decision. Before the guards arrived to escort him to the arena, he took his own life quietly, ending the performance before it could begin. His body was found draped in the same veil meant for the spectacle. He was 20 years old. The news spread quickly through Rome. Vitellius, furious at being denied his entertainment, dismissed it with a sneer. Even in death, he said, he defies the gods. The laughter of the court resumed, and by the next day, Sporus was forgotten. No funeral, no mourning, no songs. Only silence. Yet history remembered him, not as Nero's bride, not as Vitellius's victim, but as something rarer, a symbol of defiance in a world that devoured its own humanity. In choosing death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing no emperor could steal: his will. The Golden House would crumble, the empire would burn and rebuild 100 times over. But his story remained, whispered in marble halls and written in the margins of history, a warning that power without compassion is the darkest madness of all. And somewhere, beyond the reach of Rome's torches, the soul of a boy who had once been an empress finally found peace. The world moved on quickly after Sporus's death. Rome, a city built on conquest and forgetfulness, had no patience for ghosts. Within days, his name vanished from conversation, his story swallowed by new intrigues, new wars, new emperors. The empire devoured memory as easily as it devoured men. But history, unpredictable and cruelly precise, preserved him, not as a figure of scandal, but as a mirror to power itself. After Vitellius fell, the civil war continued. Vespasian would soon restore order, building a new dynasty upon the ruins of Nero's madness. The Golden House was stripped of its jewels, its halls filled with rubble. The marble that once glowed with torchlight was torn apart, repurposed to build the Colosseum, the grand amphitheater where others would die for spectacle, as Sporus had refused to do. Nero's palace, built for obsession and illusion, became the foundation of Rome's next great monument to cruelty. It was as if the empire itself could not exist without turning suffering into entertainment. The name Sporus became a whisper among writers and historians. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and others would record fragments of his story. Their tones were detached, sometimes mocking, as if describing a curiosity rather than a person. To them, Sporus was a symbol of Nero's madness, an anecdote that illustrated how far an emperor could fall. Yet between their lines, another truth lingers: the quiet tragedy of a boy caught between love and power, forced to live a life that was not his own. Sporus's existence was a question no historian could answer. What is a person's worth when stripped of choice? Was he a victim, a survivor, or a defiant spirit disguised in submission? In a world ruled by men who believed themselves divine, Sporus's suffering revealed the limits of that divinity, the cruelty of those who believed they could shape life as if sculpting marble. In the years that followed, poets and philosophers began to reflect on the moral collapse of the empire. They spoke of Nero as a cautionary tale, a man consumed by his own image. But Sporus's name, when it appeared, carried a different weight. To the moralists, he was an example of corruption, beauty turned into weakness. To others, quietly, he was a symbol of endurance, a human spirit surviving beneath layers of domination. For the people of Rome, who never knew his true story, Sporus became almost mythical. Some said his ghost wandered the ruins of the Golden House, still wearing the veil of the false empress. Others imagined that in death, he had finally reunited with the part of himself Nero had destroyed. But in reality, the boy had never belonged to the myths of emperors. He was not a legend, only a reminder, that behind every monument of power lies a face we are not meant to remember. The empire thrived for centuries after his death. New emperors came, each proclaiming to be the savior of Rome, each repeating the same old sins in new disguises. Yet the story of Sporus survived, fragile but indestructible, because it touched something deeper than politics. It exposed the cost of absolute power, not through battles or decrees, but through the silent destruction of one life. By the time scholars of later ages uncovered Nero's records, the story had become almost unrecognizable. The details blurred, the dates uncertain. But the image endured: a young man forced to become a reflection of a dead woman, an emperor marrying his own illusion, and an empire too afraid to look away. Each retelling revealed more about the storytellers than the story itself. Some condemned Nero's perversion, others dismissed Sporus's pain as spectacle. Yet no one could deny the haunting power of the tale. Centuries later, as Rome itself crumbled under the weight of invasions and decay, the ruins of Nero's palace were rediscovered. Artists and explorers entered its buried halls, their torches casting shadows on frescoes that still glimmered faintly with gold. They walked through rooms once filled with music and madness, where Sporus had stood in silence, performing a role written by tyranny. Those who saw it described a strange feeling, as if the air still held echoes of sorrow, as if beauty itself had been cursed. The Renaissance brought new fascination with Rome's past. Painters depicted Nero surrounded by fire, poets imagined Poppaea's ghost calling from beyond the grave, and scholars debated whether Sporus's fate was tragedy or punishment. Yet none of them could capture the truth. Because the story was not about Nero's love, nor Rome's decadence, but about the quiet erasure of humanity beneath the weight of obsession. Modern historians see Sporus differently. In a world that has learned, or pretends to have learned, compassion, his story becomes something timeless. It is no longer about emperors or palaces, but about the struggle to remain oneself when the world demands a mask. His defiance was not loud, not heroic in the Roman sense, it was silent. The courage to endure, to exist even when existence was rewritten by others. That silence was his rebellion. What remains most haunting about Sporus is not his death, but the life he was forced to live. The image of him sitting beside Nero in the theatre, veiled and adorned, applauding while the emperor sang, that image lingers like a wound. It speaks to every age that confuses control with love, beauty with ownership. In that image, Rome's grandeur collapses into something smaller, more human, and more terrible, the capacity of people to destroy what they claim to cherish. If history is a mirror, then Sporus's reflection is a warning. Power without empathy is theatre without soul. Empires fall, rulers fade, but cruelty survives, disguised as art, as devotion, as love. Sporus's tragedy endures because it forces us to confront the question every civilization must face. What happens when beauty becomes property and human beings become symbols? No monuments were ever built in his honor. No songs were written for him. Yet his story has outlived the emperors who sought to erase it. Every time a historian writes his name, every time an artist paints the ruins of Nero's palace, Sporus lives again, not as a victim, but as a testament to what it means to endure the unbearable. In the end, his legacy is not tragedy, but truth. The truth that even in the most gilded of prisons, the human spirit searches for freedom. That silence can be more powerful than screams. That dignity can exist even in despair. Sporus did not die in vain. He died refusing to let the empire turn his final breath into spectacle. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. Because beyond the gold, beyond the cruelty, beyond the centuries, the image of that young man standing in the ruins of Rome, wrapped in a veil of light and shadow, reminds us that humanity can survive even the darkest empire. Centuries passed, and Rome itself became a memory. An empire turned to dust beneath its own monuments. But some stories refuse to die. They linger in the cracks of marble, in the faded ink of forgotten scrolls, in the whisper of names that no one dares to speak aloud. Among those names, one glows faintly, like an ember beneath the ashes, Sporus. His life, erased by power, was never meant to be remembered. He left no statues, no descendants, no triumphs carved into stone. And yet, through the writings of those who survive him, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, fragments of his story endured. Each word they wrote carried both disdain and fascination. They describe him as a boy who resembled a woman, as Nero's living bride, as a mockery of Roman virtue. None of them saw the human behind the spectacle. But history, in its strange way, preserves even what it misunderstands. When archaeologists centuries later unearthed the ruins of Nero's Domus Aurea, they discovered walls still shimmering faintly with gold. The palace that once symbolized the emperor's madness became a monument to the passage of time. Painters and poets walk through those buried chambers with torches in hand, staring at the frescoes of gods and lovers, trying to imagine what kind of world had built such beauty out of cruelty. In the silence of those ruins, they could almost hear the echoes, the laughter, the music, the cries. And perhaps, somewhere deep in those echoes, the faintest trace of Sporus remained. The Renaissance adored the grotesque and the divine in equal measure. Artists painted Nero as a mad tyrant, his eyes wild with power, while playwrights turned his story into tragedy. But Sporus, he was something else. Some saw him as a symbol of lost innocence, others as a warning against decadence. Painters imagine him as a pale figure in flowing robes, trapped between light and shadow, his expression both fragile and eternal. They did not know his face, yet they painted him anyway, because the image of a soul consumed by empire was too powerful to ignore. As centuries rolled on, historians reinterpreted the story. In the Enlightenment, philosophers debated whether Sporus's story proved that tyranny corrupts all virtues, or whether it was merely the excess of passion left unchecked. In the Victorian era, his story became a whispered cautionary tale about moral decay and forbidden desire. But the truth, the simple, human truth, was far more universal. It was about what happens when power tries to recreate love and destroys it instead. Sporus's name became a mirror held up to every age that followed. When rulers sought to control art, or when nations glorified strength over compassion, his ghost seemed to flicker in the background, a reminder of what humanity loses when it forgets empathy. Every civilization that read his story saw itself in it: the arrogance, the blindness, the tragedy of believing one can own another's soul. In modern times, the story of Sporus found new meaning. Scholars began to see him not as a curiosity, but as a symbol of identity and endurance. He was no longer the emperor's living doll, but a person crushed between the extremes of love and power. Psychologists saw in his life the pattern of trauma, how abuse disguises itself as affection, how control wears the mask of devotion. Writers reimagined him in novels and plays, not as a victim alone, but as a survivor whose final act, choosing death over degradation, was a declaration of agency. In academic circles, his name began to appear alongside those of figures who had suffered for being different, misunderstood, or manipulated by systems greater than themselves. Sporus became a metaphor for anyone stripped of identity by the powerful, for every voice silenced, every soul forced into a shape it did not choose. And yet, even stripped of symbolism, his story remains heartbreakingly simple. A young man who wanted to live, caught in the orbit of a man who mistook obsession for love. Nero believed he could conquer death by remaking life, and in doing so, he destroyed both. Sporus's tragedy is not about gender or politics or empire. It is about the universal truth that love without freedom is not love at all. If one stands today within the ruins of the Domus Aurea, the air still hums with something sacred and terrible. The golden mosaics, now faded, still reflect light in strange ways, as if the walls themselves remember what they witnessed. Some say the palace feels haunted, not by Nero's ghost, but by something quieter, a presence that lingers, unjudging, sorrowful, and free. Perhaps that is Sporus, or perhaps it is simply the echo of his story, refusing to be silenced. In one of the lower chambers, archaeologists once found a small bronze mirror, cracked but polished, lying beside fragments of marble and ash. No one knows whose it was. Some say it belonged to a servant, others like to imagine it was his. When light strikes it at a certain angle, the reflection splinters into a dozen fragments, one face becoming many. It is an image both literal and symbolic, the self divided, redefined, but never entirely erased. And so the story of Sporus endures not because of what he suffered, but because of what it reveals. It shows how absolute power destroys the boundary between beauty and cruelty, between art and abuse. It reminds us that empires do not fall only through wars and politics, but through the quiet corruption of their humanity. The fall of Nero was not just the end of a ruler, it was the collapse of an illusion, that love can be created through control, that obedience can replace identity. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, his story resonates. In an age where image and illusion still rule, where fame often disguises emptiness, and power still demands masks, the tragedy of Sporus feels uncomfortably familiar. He stands as a timeless reflection of what happens when people are treated as symbols instead of souls. Perhaps that is why artists still return to him, because through his silence, he speaks. Through his suffering, he exposes the fragility of all power built on lies. And through his final act of defiance, he reminds us that even when stripped of everything, the human spirit can still choose dignity over despair. In the end, Sporus did not conquer his world. He could not. But his story, preserved in fragments and whispers, conquered time itself. Empires have risen and fallen, gods have changed their names, kings and tyrants have come and gone. Yet somewhere, beneath the ruins of Rome, his name still breathes. The boy who was forced to be an empress, the prisoner who became a mirror, his truth endures in every story about the cost of love and the abuse of power. It is a truth as old as history and as present as tomorrow, that the measure of a civilization is not in its monuments or armies, but in how it remembers the smallest voice among its shadows. And so, when the sun sets over the ancient city, casting golden light upon the broken walls of Nero's palace, one might imagine a faint silhouette walking among the ruins, not as a ghost, but as a reminder. That beauty without mercy is hollow. That power without compassion is madness. And that even in silence, a single life can echo through eternity. History loves clean endings, a fallen tyrant, a restored order, a city reborn. But the truth rarely closes so neatly. After Nero's death and Sporus's final act, Rome did what great powers always do. It absorbed the shock, rebalanced its rituals, and kept moving. Marble was repurposed, titles reassigned, loyalties reshuffled. The empire adjusted its mask and continued the performance. Yet beneath the noise of victory processions and senatorial decrees, a quieter question persisted, one that no triumph could silence. What does power cost when it spends human lives like coin? Sporus's story does not end with him. It begins with us. It compels us to examine the scaffolding that held his tragedy in place, the etiquette that taught courtiers to applaud, the institutions that taught physicians to obey, the culture that taught citizens to look away. Every layer of Roman life, from religion to law, from theatre to politics, allowed one man's grief to become another man's fate. That is the uncomfortable inheritance of empire. Cruelty does not require a monster, only a system willing to turn away while harm is done in its name. Look, for instance, at the palace professionals who stitched illusion into policy. Tailors pinned robes upon a trembling body, jewelers reset Poppaea's gems to fit a new brow, scribes revised titles and ledgers to make the fiction official. None of them wielded a sword, and yet their craft became the instruments of erasure. The empire did not need the arena to stage its spectacle. It needed a bureaucracy that could dress violence in ceremony and call it love. The Senate learned the same lesson in reverse. Having survived Nero, the senators congratulated themselves on their prudence. They had bowed when bowing preserved their lives. They had whispered when whispering preserved their influence. In the aftermath, some would cite Sporus as proof of the late emperor's depravity. But condemnation after the fact is a cheaper courage than truth spoken in the moment. The record leaves a silence where their defense of him might have been. In that silence, an entire political class stands reflected, polished, eloquent, and carefully absent at the hour when a single voice might have mattered. Even Rome's taste for theatre acquires a darker meaning in this light. Public performance was the empire's language. Men sought honor beneath the gaze of crowds. Nero's stage simply spilled from amphitheatre to palace, turning life into spectacle. When Sporus processed beside the emperor, veiled and adorned, the city beheld not just an individual but a doctrine, that beauty belongs to power, that grief justifies possession, that the body itself may be scripted for public meaning. The audience knew the play was wrong, but applause is safer than protest when the stage belongs to a god. What, then, is the lesson? It is tempting to reduce Sporus to a symbol, to say he represents innocence, or identity, or the soul against the machine. Yet symbols, too, can erase people. Sporus was not an allegory. He was a person with a voice that history did not record. The dignity we owe him now is to refuse both the emperor's illusion and our own. Not a doll, not a ghost, not a myth, a young man, intelligent and observant, who measured each day by the breath between obedience and annihilation. He found a way to endure for a time, and when endurance itself became complicity in his own public desecration, he chose the one act still his to choose. This is not tragedy as entertainment. This is tragedy as testimony. And testimony demands witnesses. The past has given us roles to play. To the scholar, it offers the duty to separate embroidery from bone, to read the sneer out of ancient prose and listen for the human cry beneath it. To the artist, it offers the task of rebuilding not the palace, but the person, to give voice where silence was enforced. To the citizen, it offers an ethical mirror. Where do we applaud when we should object? Whom do we allow to be rewritten for our comfort? The specifics of Rome are gone, but the temptations remain. To romanticize control, to confuse spectacle for truth, to accept the erasure of one life as the price of maintaining the shine on the collective mask. Consider how the city repurposed Nero's dream. The Golden House, shimmering with stolen light, was quarried to raise the Colosseum. From a theatre of private obsession rose a theatre of public appetite. The stones did not change their nature, only the script changed. Yet Sporus's refusal to be paraded as Persephone under Vitellius breaks that logic. In a world that converts bodies into meaning, he withheld his own. There is a clarity in that refusal that no empire can absorb. It hangs in the air like a bell, still ringing after the audience has gone home. His legacy, therefore, is not merely a caution against tyrants. It is a charge against bystanders. Nero could not have remade a person without a chorus of the willing, men and women who adjusted the costume, tuned the lyre, oiled the hinges of the ceremonial door. We may not wear togas or salute eagles, but the mechanics of complicity are timeless. A shrug, a smirk, a contract signed for just this once. Sporus's life exposes the cost of each small assent. And yet, there is more than warning here. There is also a quiet doctrine of hope. The empire claimed that identity could be manufactured from above, that a ring, a robe, a title could turn a life into a role. The ending of Sporus's story denies that claim. In protecting the last undefiled space of choice, he preserves something larger than himself, the principle that a human being is not fully annexable by power. That principle, once seen, cannot be unseen. It crosses centuries like light across dust, illuminating every room where authority mistakes possession for love. If you walk today through the damp corridors of the buried palace, you will find patches of gold still clinging to the ceiling. They glitter dimly, as if embarrassed by their former brilliance. The guidebooks will speak of engineering and fresco technique, of octagonal rooms and rotating dining halls. They will note dates and dynasties and the theatre of imperial taste. But if you pause in the hush between tour groups and listen for something that is not part of the exhibit, you may hear a different history, one that moves without trumpets, written not in triumphs but in withdrawals, a boy stepping back from a threshold, choosing not to enter the arena prepared for his unmaking. That, finally, is the human cost of empire. Not only the bodies it breaks, but the silences it demands. Not only the monuments it raises, but the lives it edits out. Rome teaches us that grandeur can be built upon the deletion of the inconvenient. Sporus teaches us that deletion is not the last word. A name spoken softly across millennia can outlast the marble that tried to contain it. So when we finish the tale, when the music fades and the credits roll, we should refuse the comfort of closure. Let the question remain open. Where, in our own palaces of preference and policy, do we allow another's personhood to be rewritten for ease, for profit, for spectacle? If Sporus must return to the stage, let it be not as a prop, but as a presence. Let his story perform its one necessary miracle, to turn spectators into witnesses, and witnesses into guardians of the line between love and domination. Empires will always rehearse. That is their nature. But if we remember the cost, if we carry the name of a single life through the corridors of our bright constructions, then perhaps the next golden house will be built with windows rather than mirrors, and the light that enters will be meant for seeing, not for staging. And in that light, the figure at the center will not be a puppet carved from grief, but a person unafraid to be fully, irrevocably human.